exploring the bizarre. Your e-ticket ride into the world of the paranormal. Strap yourself in as we traverse the universe exploring the unexplained. UFOs, ghosts, lost worlds, cryptozoology, as well as other dimensions. It's time to take back the night. Now, your electrifying hosts of Exploring the Bizarre, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
It's secret Russian UFO messages. Top secret. Wait, here comes some more. I got it all written down. Tim, look.
Well, what does it say?
How would I know? You think I can read Morse code?
Okay, well, wait a minute here. I learned some Morse code when I was a Boy Scout trying to get my ham radio badge. Let me try to translate.
What does it say?
Okay, this part says the week is long.
It sure is. What else does it say?
The silver cat feeds when blue meets yellow in the west.
Keep reading. I think it's working.
No, it isn't. This is nonsense.
This is why that big red UFO is hovering our way. I think it's going to make going to attack us or something.
Okay. Well, let's get back to the KCR studios. Maybe Nick Redfern can answer our questions for us in a safer way. I think we spend all of our time on the show running away from stuff.
You know, I swear we get better at this all the time. You know, I'm waiting for somebody at Netflix or Hulu to get in touch with us and want to do a Saturday a cartoon series. Although I guess cartoons are not on Saturday anymore, and they're not aimed at kids. We were originally going to do this with a Boris and Natasha accent, but we didn't know who was going to be Natasha. Didn't want to do it, and you know, I felt kind of I wasn't transgendering at this point.
My Natasha isn't very good, and you'll never come up to Paul Frees.
How about my Boris? It could use some improvement.
Yeah, just a little.
By this time, our guest has probably fled. Although we'll rope him back in. I believe. Tim, so you and I have been busy finishing up that book, Area 51 Warning, Keep Out. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be a busy week for us. We've got a lot of shows and all lined up, and we're anxious to see what goes on out there. Now, I won't be going there myself. It's a long way from Manhattan, and it's a long, dusty drive. You know, last time I was out there, if it wasn't because of the two very attractive young ladies in my convertible, I'd be a marshmallow right now. Ran out of gas. You know, they said, you got to get gas. Make sure you're filled up because there's no gas for 90 miles. And I could have swore that I gassed up, but I guess I didn't, because somewhere along the line we sputtered and the car came to a halt. And I guess I can blame it on the girls and the loud music and the fresh, hot air. But luckily, the traffic slowed, all three cars in a half an hour, and a gentleman with a motorboat that he was hauling stopped and actually siphoned gas for us, much to the chagrin of his wife. But I thank Helen and Paige for getting me out of a jam, because I'd be out there with the roadkill. But anyway, let us go on with the evening's show. Tim, tell us who we're having on this evening, because it's an old friend of ours.
That's right. Well, as we said in our introduction, Nick Redfern's making a return visit to Exploring the Bizarre. Always happy to have Nick with us, because it's always going to be a fascinating show when Nick is with us. Now, Nick is a full-time author and journalist specializing in a wide range of unsolved mysteries, including Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, UFO sightings, government conspiracies, you name it. Among his many exploits, Nick has investigated reports of lake monsters in Scotland, vampires in Puerto Rico, werewolves in England, aliens in Mexico, and sea serpents in the United States. Nick travels and lectures extensively around the world. Originally from England, he currently lives in Dallas, Texas. His most recent books include one of the books we're going to be talking about tonight, Flying Saucers from the Kremlin. He's also written Top Secret Alien Abduction Files and Area 51, The Revealing Truth of UFOs, Secret Aircraft Cover-Up, and Conspiracies. Right up our alley this time around.
Well, we know we got to ask Nick the first question out of the gate here. Are you going to storm the fence?
I knew that was going to be the first question.
Psychic, psychic too.
It's a good question. I actually won't be. You know, my view on it, I guess, might be quite different to that of a lot of people in ufology, or not. You know, it's difficult to say. But the way I look at it is like this: if you want to investigate and research Area 51, that's one thing. And if you want to sort of, you know, hang out in the little towns in the area and, you know, knock back some beers and have a few joints, you know, and just hang out.
Little Alien Inn. Got to stop at the Little Alien Inn and talk to Pat. You know, she's had aliens materialize inside the bar there and all. I mean, she's serious about this.
Yeah. But I mean, to me, that's all fine. You know, everybody has like a cool time, sort of leaning against the hood of the car and everybody, you know, 30, 40, 50 people all chatting about Area 51. That's fine. But for me, at least, I don't think anyone should be contemplating or seriously thinking about the idea of trying to invade a U.S. military base, because that's basically what this, you know, much of this came down to, you know, was the idea of trying to basically storm Area 51. That was the term, you know, that was used. But if you think about it, just because Area 51 is sort of seen as this mysterious, cool place where there might be dead aliens and live aliens and crashed UFOs, just because of that, it doesn't mean it gives you the right to try and literally break into a U.S. military base. I mean, it's really no different to 500 people trying to break into the Pentagon. And you imagine what the furor there would be if that happened. So, to me, nobody should be doing this at all, you know, trying to break in.
Okay, but Nick, let me say this. When you say break in, it's not like there's barbed wire or extensive fencing around the base. You walk over a line. There's a sign that says, don't walk over this line or something will happen to you.
Right.
But, I mean, to me, that's not high security. If they really want to keep you out, they put a fence around it.
Well, no, it's not like climbing a fence, you know, around your local Air Force or military base. You're right. Basically, what it comes down to is, you know, there are certain huge portions of the Nevada desert which are essentially under the control of the military. And what it basically sort of comes down to is that if you try and get within about 15 miles of the base, even though there's no sort of literal fence all around there, when you get to about 15 miles of where the perimeter is, you will be stopped by security guards.
Whack and hut.
Yeah, like arrested and fined and, you know, put in the local sheriff's jail for like 3 days to teach you a lesson. So
we don't know. Has that ever happened? You think that's ever happened?
Oh yeah, there's been a number of occasions when people have tried that. I mean, there was the most recent one I can think of was about 2 or 3 years ago when an Irish from Ireland, an Irish TV company decided to go out there, and they didn't listen or, you know, follow the warnings, and they ended up paying something like a $500 fine each, and like something like a night or 2 nights in the local jail, and just, you know, given the the fear of God put in them, that kind of thing. So that still goes on. Now, if you've got, hypothetically, 300 or 400 people doing that, charging across the desert, it's not going to work out well,
I can't imagine. Somehow, I just, that is so, first of all, even if you got across the line, you're not, the aliens are not hanging out in the guard shack. They're off 20 miles in an underground bunker, 7 stories below the earth. But hey, you wrote a book on this. I got a book that just came out, Area 51, Warning, Keep Out. What's the title of your book? I know I have it here on the shelf.
Well, it's called Area 51. It's one of those no-brainer titles, and
yeah.
But the subtitle sort of deals with UFOs. Secret aircraft and conspiracies, and so. But it was actually, the book came out. It was kind of timely, but it really was a coincidence because the book was actually finished about 4 months ago, something like that, and the publisher got it out quickly. And then about a week or two after the book had its official publication date, that's when the story came out after that about this whole storming issue. So.
Well, what is it? What is your take on it? Is there back engineering going on out there, or was there? Because probably they've all taken it somewhere else after all the shenanigans going on. Is there back technology going on out there? Are there aliens there somewhere underground, or is it just the home of the U2?
Well, I think it's one of two things. Either there are living and dead aliens and crashed UFOs out there, or for some sort of like weird disinformation, psychological warfare angle, there is somebody or an organization that wants us to think that that's what's going on. And it could even be a combination of the two. But I think if you look at the history of Area 51, you find that over the years and decades, there have been a lot of weird mind games out there to where people don't really know what's the truth and what isn't. And I think part of that's been done deliberately to try and sort of prevent people from learning the bigger picture. But the big question is, what's the bigger picture? Is it aliens? Is it classified military aircraft that are sort of 20, 30 years ahead of what we're told about?
And how about Bob Lazar? What's your take on him?
Well, a lot of people totally write off Lazar, but I actually don't, and I'll tell you why. The reason I don't. I'm sure both me and Tim have over the years come across a number of people in the UFO field who are just outright hoaxers. Now, those typical hoaxers, they tend to, they come up with this fantastic story. They go all across the lecture circuit, conferences, on TV, get big book deals, etc., etc. Well, Lazar had this fantastic story to tell. But if you look at the history of him, he never really capitalized on it. I mean, he never wrote his own book. He never had anybody else ghostwrite a book for him. He didn't sell the rights to like some huge Hollywood company to make his movie with someone like Tom Cruise playing, Bob Lazar, that kind of thing. And you hardly ever saw him on the lecture circuit or at conferences. He really was in the background. And if you look at his story also, he didn't really gain anything from it. So, in other words, he didn't come across like your average hoaxer whose goal is to sell all their copies of their books and then keep the story circulating and adding to the story new lies when the story comes to an end. Lazar, whether you believe him or not, he did not come across like the average UFO hoaxer. I mean, that is a fact.
Well, now I have my own take on this. I believe that he is fronting for someone else. In other words, that there's someone there, someone else who told him this story and said, Bob, why don't you go out and take credit for it? Somebody that's playing behind the scenes and using Bob as the puppet. And I think that might be what's happening in some of these cases, is that they find someone to front for them because they don't want to. I mean, he has been a public figure, and he does seem to like the attention. He's the type of guy. Well, I don't do a lot of shows, and I don't do this and that and the other thing, but he does. I mean, kind of. I mean, it's not like he's been on the Coast to Coast, and he was on the old Art Bell show, and there's a movie out about him now, and so forth. But anyway, let's move on to your new book on Russia, the title of which is
Flying Saucers from the Kremlin.
Always been very, very interested in former Soviet sightings, Russian sightings. In fact, when I was a teenager, there was a magazine called Sputnik, which was put together by Russian editors and distributed here in the United States. It was a little digest magazine, and we had like a USA magazine that they allowed us to sell and distribute in Russian in the Soviet Union. And they did have a couple of articles, like on ancient astronauts. The big author of their ancient astronauts theory, which I think was even before Van Daniken, was Professor Egros, and he had written on the Dogu of Japan and so forth and so on. So I wrote a letter to the editor in Sputnik magazine, and they published it with my address. And at 15 years old, I began to receive mail written in poor English and languages that I didn't understand in some cases from behind the Soviet bloc. And some of them were pretty good cases. So even though officially the Russian government played this down, there was some information that was available on the subject. Now, you know, and you've probably written about this in your book. There is the equivalent of an Area 51 in Russia. Putnyar.
Yeah,
Are you familiar with?
There are.
Yeah.
There are a few places in Russia, particularly in the Ural Mountains, which we know from satellites flights over the area, that in the Ural Mountains, that over the years, the Russians have actually sort of quarried out and dug out massive underground areas and constructed huge, underground bunkers and installations, for whatever reason. Whether it's to survive a nuclear war or, an Area 51 type situation, we don't know. But there's no doubt that these massive quarried out facilities in the Ural Mountains absolutely exist. There's no doubt about that at all.
Well, there was an incident that supposedly took place in the area surrounding Yar, where there was a dogfight between a Soviet pilot and a UFO, and I think the UFO was shot down or crashed, and they did some reverse technology on that. There were apparently a lot of incidences, or at least this is what we were led to believe, of Soviet pilots exchanging combat with these unidentified objects.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of, UFO cases in Russia that parallel, what we see in the United States, or anywhere in the world. It just demonstrates that it is a global phenomenon, and it would be a surprise if a nation the size of Russia wasn't getting UFO encounters, really.
Well, where did you get the bulk of your information? Did you exchange correspondence with some Russians, or go through former KGB files?
Well, there was a little bit like that, but the book itself is not so much a study of UFO encounters in Russia, but it's how the Russians used the UFO subject as a means to sort of to use disinformation, counterintelligence, meddling, and spying as a means to use the UFO subject as a tool of essentially to sort of affect the U.S. mindset, and the idea of creating and circulating hysteria within the U.S. And that's sort of the primary goal or story and scenario of the book. And it actually starts with George Adamski. Now, back in the 1980s, the FBI released their surveillance file on Adamski, which was about 75 pages. I actually managed to get their most recent version. When I say version, I mean because they've released other papers now. But the surveillance file that's now being released by the FBI is just over 400 pages on Adamski alone. And it talks in there, it talks in that particular file as to how the FBI was deeply concerned that Adamski might have been working with the Russians. And the reason why they thought that was because in a number of his early lectures, Adamski said that the so-called Space Brothers had a somewhat communist-type government.
Yeah,
now, that kind of sounds a bit odd and weird, but that's how it was described back then. Now, if you think with his first book, Flying Saucers of Lander, which came out in 1953, in no time that book sold 125,000 copies. And as the FBI's files show, they were deeply concerned that Adamski was using the UFO subject as a cover to spread communism, saying that the aliens he met were communists. Yeah. Now, whether you buy into that or not, that actually was the theory that the FBI was following, and for that reason, they put him under surveillance for years because they felt that if somebody was just doing a lecture on a Monday or Sunday afternoon in a local library, and half a dozen people turned up, the FBI probably wouldn't have bothered or taken any notice at all. But the fact that he was selling book sales in the figures of 125,000 and people were coming along to see him speak in their thousands, and he was saying essentially communism is good, that's what the FBI was worried about. They genuinely thought, right or not, they genuinely thought that he'd been sort of turned. He'd been turned and he was being used by the Russians as a means to find an alternative way to spread communism in America.
Oh boy, what a way to do it! But I guess if you don't go along with the Space Brothers philosophy, they put you on one of the frozen moons of Saturn. I mean, their idea of Siberia, one of the frozen moons of Saturn. I guess you you go. Well, we're coming.
Kind of on the same.
We got a break coming up here, but we will be right back to continue with the great conversation with the great Nick Redfern, and Tim Swartz will be on.
Now back to exploring the bizarre with two of the most electrifying researchers in the paranormal. Your hosts, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
Welcome back to Exploring the Bizarre. I'm Tim Swartz. Tonight we're talking with Nick Redfern, and his current book is called Flying Saucers from the Kremlin. Nick, at the very beginning of your book, you present an interesting a story from somebody else's book about the Roswell crash, and one of the possible out of thousands, I think, at this point, explanations of what may actually have occurred there, and this this story is, to me, it's really fascinating. First of all, because it's very similar to an idea that you had presented even before. The book that we're talking about came out. But once again, I mean, we're bringing into this idea that possibly Russia has had something to do with the UFO mystery, at least here in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, the story you're talking about came from a woman named Annie Jacobson, who about 9 years ago, I think it was 9 years ago, wrote her own book on Area 51. And she was given a very strange and bizarre, almost bizarre story of what one of her insider sources claimed was the truth. behind Roswell. And the man in question, this elderly man, was named Alfred O'Donnell, who's now dead. He died about 3 or 4 years ago. And he spent a lot of his time working in and around the whole Area 51 facility. And he said that what came down on Roswell was not a UFO and aliens. He said it was like a remote-controlled aircraft which had surgically altered children on board to make them look like aliens. And the plan supposedly was to try and create hysteria in the US by creating something similar to Orson Welles' War of the Worlds situation, which made people think, there really was an alien invasion. And according to the story told to Annie Jacobson, Russia staged the Roswell event to try and make America think aliens were invading. But personally, I don't buy into this story because, the idea that in the 1940s you could surgically alter children to make them look like aliens when we really didn't have a concept of what aliens looked like back then, that's one thing. And then the other angle is, how could these altered poor children, fly, this futuristic aircraft from Russia to the United States? Well, according to the story that O'Donnell said, the plane or this bizarre aircraft was remotely flown by another, which sounds, again, sort of far too advanced to me for the 1940s. So I think Alfred O'Donnell, he either firmly believed the story he was telling to Annie Jacobson, or he was deliberately giving Annie Jacobson disinformation to hide whatever the big story really was and still is at Roswell.
Well, and it sounds to me that Jacobson didn't really do her homework when it came to some of the players involved. I mean, like supposedly the aircraft had been built by the Horton brothers, who had originally developed aircraft for Nazi Germany. While at that time, the Horton brothers weren't in Russia; they were in Argentina, probably. And let's see, Joseph Mengele.
Well, one of them actually did. Yeah, one of them did go to Argentina. But I mean, one of the things that sort of makes me sort of suspect that Annie Jacobson was given a fake story. And I should stress, she wasn't in any way involved in fakery or anything like that. She just told the story as it was told to her.
Right.
But, what I would say is that one of the things she mentions in the book is that the inside of the craft had sort of German writing and Russian writing and symbols in there. And, of course, that begs the question, well, if you want to confuse people and have them believe that it was alien, why on earth would you put Russian writing inside the craft? It wouldn't take long for someone who knew Russian to say, well, hang on a minute, this is Russian. This isn't, some bizarre, strange alien language. It's the Russian language. And so, to me, it's bizarre that they would even sort of have Russian writing inside the craft. It would give it away almost immediately. And as I said, it was well thought out because, like you said, I mean, it involved the Horton brothers and some of their strange aircraft designs, and it also included Joseph Mengele, who was one of the craziest, dangerous, evil people of the Second World War, who actually did have a very disturbing fascination with dwarfs. That's actually true. Mm-hmm. And he performed all sorts of bizarre experiments, terrible experiments on dwarfs. And so, a lot of the components had been put into that story that Alfred O'Donnell gave to Annie Jacobson. But for me, there are so many odd aspects, that I just don't think in the 40s, we could achieve all that.
Well, and that plays in, though, with the whole United States government being very fearful, especially starting in the 1950s, that somehow the whole UFO phenomena / movement was somehow being either orchestrated by the Soviet Union, or the Soviet Union was using that for whatever reasons, propaganda, disinformation, trying to, find out more, about military secrets in the United States, what have you.
Well, yeah, I mean, this brings up sort of a good point. When I was doing the research for the book, I actually got hold of some old correspondence from one of the sort of second wave of the 1950s contactees, a guy named Orfeo Angelucci, who I know Tim will know very well who Angelucci was. And, he was, like I said, he was part of like the second wave of UFOs, of contactees after like Adamski and Van Tassel and Hunt Williamson and people like that. And in his private correspondence, Angelucci said that on a number of occasions when he was lecturing, he would have these sort of sinister groups of people would come up to him, these guys talking in what he described as like a European accent. And they tried to convince him to insert the scenario of the aliens being communists into his lectures. Now, this went on sort of 4 or 5 times where this almost like sinister type of group followed Angelucci around the US, and it got quite almost like bullying. We need you to do this. We want you to, impress on people that the aliens that you met were communist, and he would not do it. And the FBI actually got wind of this as well. And the FBI pointed out to him that, he wasn't in any trouble, and they were pleased he'd actually approached them. But what's interesting is that I got the story through his private correspondence and some of the things that he'd been writing in his books. But when I contacted the FBI, I found that, yes, they actually did have a file on Angelucci, but they destroyed it in 2009. And that's in writing. The FBI said, yes, we had this file on Angelucci, but unfortunately it was destroyed 10 years ago. And we don't know why it was destroyed. I mean, the Van Tassel file, you can go to the FBI's website, the Vault, and download the George Van Tassel file, which is about 450 pages, and read it. Bill Cooper, the conspiracy theorist of the 1980s, 90s, his file's huge, and you can read that at the Vault, the FBI's website. So, and Frank Scully, Silas Newton's files, they're all there online as PDFs for you to download freely. And yet, for some reason, Angelucci's file was relegated to the furnace or the shredder,
Now, are they keeping, just a sec, are they keeping tabs on any ufologists currently? I mean, I guess Stan Friedman claims that they had a file on him, right?
Well, they did. I mean, since Stan died, a couple of people have applied for his file, but there's no kind of smoking gun or anything like that. It's sort of 30 or 40 pages that really don't amount to anything. But what I would say, is that we know that back in the 80s, because they admitted it, the FBI back in the 80s had a file of about 78 or 80 pages on Bill Moore, who co-wrote with Charles Billitz the Roswell incident. So we don't, Moore's file could be considerably longer by now. But the ones that the FBI have posted to their website, the Vault, include, as I said, Bill Cooper, George Van Tassel, also in the UFO subject, Frank Scully, Silas Newton and Leo Jabauer, who are big players in the Aztec crashed UFO story. The entire cattle mutilation files are on file at the Vault as well. But there are some interesting files which have been removed. For example, some of the earlier contactee files have been removed. They were on prior at one point, and they're gone. Like, for example, there was one on Howard Mengele that was taken down, and you have to wonder what's the reason for that. So the files are interesting, but it is kind of weird that from time to time they suddenly decide to remove some of them or even destroy them, like in the example of Angelo Chi.
So I can see why the United States government in the 50s may have worried about some of the things that these contactees were saying, because the majority of them talked about how the Space Brothers had told them that, the planets that they came from, utopia, one world government, there was no money, everything was free, everybody, shared and shared alike. What
a terrible concept.
Yeah, but in the 1950s, you might as well have just said, this is socialism or communism. I mean,
they would say that. They would say that today. Certainly, Wall Street and the banking, Federal Reserve and all that. You think there'd be any difference today? I don't think so.
Well, I think one of the main things is that back in the certainly late 40s, early 50s, and through most of the 50s, there was a great deal of paranoia about Russians and Russians under the beds, that kind of things. Reds under the beds, and the idea of Soviet penetration, and there was McCarthyism, and so I think it was an era that the Russians sort of realized they could kind of use this to their advantage, whereas today, well, I say today, up until a couple of years ago, that had all pretty much gone. But now today, with the whole Russian meddling thing again, that whole paranoia is kind of coming back again, and and the Russians are sort of meddling again. So, but yeah, back then, I think the Russians knew that they could use this to their advantage. And I think the reason why it worked is because both sides knew that the big irony is both sides knew, the West and the East, that there is a real UFO phenomenon, but they chose to exploit that real phenomenon as a means to, as I said, create paranoia, hysteria, and worry as to what was going on.
Well, and there were actually rumors in the 1950s that every civilian UFO group had been infiltrated by at least one Soviet agent. Which, I mean, that's a lot of Soviet agents. If that was was a true rumor,
Well, yeah, I mean, this is an interesting, angle of the whole story that I talk about in the book. The idea that the UFO groups in the US were being monitored and watched by US officials because they were worried that the researchers were being sort of swayed by communism, but also they were looking. But also the Russians allegedly were sort of looking at the angle of infiltration of UFO groups. And one of the particularly interesting things that the Russians were trying to do was to approach people in ufology who also worked in the aviation world. And they would sort of try and tease them, hey, you're working in US aviation world, and if you tell us what's going on, we'll give you a few nuggets of what's going on in Russia in relation to UFOs. So it was like a dangling carrot scenario, and it's a very kind of bizarre sort of situation, as it all sort of played out, and the means and the reasons why to kind of use all this as a means to just screw with people's minds, really, more than anything else. But one of the when you mention this about all the UFO groups being monitored, this story was actually given to Jim Moseley back in the 1950s by a guy named Charles Samwick. Now, Charles Samwick was someone who worked in US Army intelligence in the 50s, and I actually, through the Freedom of Information Act, managed to get some of his files, and he certainly did work in the field of counterintelligence, in other words, fabricating and creating material to push the Russians down, the wrong paths and confuse them. So despite the fact that, Jim was somebody who liked to sort of play around with ufology, in terms of the Charles Samwick saga, he really was who Jim claimed him to be. He really did work in U.S. intelligence, and he had a lot of information on how the Russians were trying to infiltrate American ufology, and did work in the fields of disinformation, counterintelligence, and messing with the Russian mindset.
Well, and that brings us up to more recent times, especially the 1980s, when you had the possibility that say, well, okay, we'll go back to like Area 51, that possibly the whole rumor that Area 51 was testing extraterrestrial spacecraft was kind of almost a honey trap to try to lure in Russian agents who were trying to find out, say, about the testing of what would later become the stealth bomber and stealth fighters and things like that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the CIA was very worried that in the 1980s, when more and more sophisticated high-tech aircraft were being tested out there was a great deal of worry that the Russians would sort of provide under-the-table payments to people who worked out at Area 51, and in return, they would get something of value to them, whether it be money or in some cases it might be people in US intelligence who had a personal interest in UFOs, and the Russians said, well, we'll give you some cool UFO material if you tell us what's going on with your latest aircraft designs. And you're right, it is like a lure, sort of the dangling carrot scenario and pulling someone in. And the Russians would in essence give the people in the US, the Area 51 or wherever, totally bogus fake material, and the Russians in return, from their perspective, the hope would be that they would get something solid in return. And the CIA and both the Defense Intelligence Agency, both of them came to suspect that the Majestic 12 documents that Stan Friedman championed for so many years, they came to suspect, they didn't have proof, but they suspected that the MJ12 documents were created by the Russians, and the plan was to provide these documents with people who worked out at Area 51, and again hoped they'd get something real in return, whereas what they would actually, the other side would get, the Americans, would be bogus documents on Majestic 12. So, it's a fascinating scenario, the idea that the Russians cooked up the MJ12 documents as kind of like a magnet to pull in people who they could hire from within US intelligence and turn them into sort of double agents.
Well, and that brings us up to today. And is this kind of activity still taking place? I mean, you had mentioned earlier, you had the whole paranoia of the Soviets don't exist anymore, the Russians, trying to infiltrate our elections and things like that. It seems like that the same kind of tricks are still going on even today.
Well, actually, it is, and I'll give you a perfect example of it. When the whole issue of Edward Snowden started just a few years back, you've got this guy who becomes literally overnight, depending how you look at him. Some people saw him as, public enemy number one. Other people saw him as a hero, revealing how the US population was potentially being watched and surveyed, whether through social media, iPhones, etc. Now, one of the things that a lot of people don't know is that one of the particular documents that and files that Snowden released was called How Covert Agents Infiltrate the Internet. And it was a document, but that basically explained how people's reputations could be destroyed by using the internet. Now, one particular aspect of this document shows a number of images of flying saucers, and we still don't know why UFOs or images of UFOs are contained within this particular document that details and describes how to infiltrate the internet and shatter people's reputations. So this demonstrates that in some strange way, the whole psychological warfare, manipulating people in ufology is still going on. And that particular document is important because it goes back to just a couple of years when it surfaced, and we learned that UFOs were somehow being used as a tool, to manipulate and crash down, reputations, and again, it had nothing to do with real UFOs, but everything to do with finding ways to destroy the mindset of people who are being targeted.
All right, we got less than really about a minute left to go on the show. So, Flying Saucers from the Kremlin and your other books, Nick, where can people find those?
Well, all my books are on Amazon, and about 50-60% of them, for people who still like to go to bookstores, you can get them from Barnes & Noble.
All right, great. And Tim Beckley, Area 51, Warning, Keep Out. Is that, can people get that now?
It's available. It's available now, and if they order tonight, it's an incredible price, and it's got to go up within a day. It's just an incredible price. I don't know why I did this. I was out in the desert, and it was just too much. And don't forget, too, the Ashtar's Space Brothers Speak.
All right.
Mark Briggerhoff, yes, our friend of ours.
Well, Nick, thank you very much for being with us tonight.
All right, thanks, guys. I'll see you later.
You're welcome. See you in Russia.
Okay.
All right. Good night, everyone. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to Exploring the Bizarre with hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz. They're taking back the night by jetting non-stop across the cosmos in search of the truly bizarre and totally unexplained, with you as their co-pilot. Thursday nights at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10 p.m. Eastern, on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. For more information on Exploring the Bizarre and hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz, check out their KCOR Digital Radio Network page. Follow their YouTube channel at MRUFO 1100. Exploring the Bizarre.